So during the civil rights era, there were two people who really kind of started the movement for that. The first is Rosa Parks, and the second is Emmett Till. Um, so we all know a little bit about Rosa Parks already, but can anybody here tell me about Emmett Till? Uh, Maybe you guys can tell me without your textbooks. Uh, Maybe you just know the story. No? Okay. Well, so basically, Emmett Till was a black man who was visiting family in Chicago, and he had stopped to ask a white woman a question. And the white woman was very scared and intimidated that a black man had approached her and started talking to her on the street. So she went home and told her husband, and then her husband killed Emmett Till. Um, and a lot of people believe that Rosa Parks' rebellion on the bus boycotts, was uh, partially a response to the murder of Emmett Till. Um, but anyway, when the man who murdered Emmett Till went to trial, there was an all-white jury who found him not guilty. Um, and so basically, he got away with murder. And uh, uh, an all-white jury found a black man, or found a white man not guilty, and he was let off with no sentencing. Um, and so the Northern America started to become more upset about these issues, and it started to gain a lot more wind up in the north, and the issue started to spread. Um, so back to Rosa Parks. Who was she? She was a member of the NAACP, um, and she had been arrested 2 times before her famous arrest on the bus. Um, and she was the start of the bus boycotts, the bus boycotting system. And many people followed that movement, and it was actually very successful. But does anybody know why this was particularly impactful and why this actually made a difference? Well, so the reason is because the bus system is how the black community got around. So when they were boycotting the bus system, basically they had to walk or they had to find other modes of transportation if somebody had a car, or, most of the time they would just walk places. That's kind of what they did. And church groups actually started to rent out buses, like they started to have their own buses. So religious organizations would have buses providing rides for people instead of them using the city bus systems. And many people were jailed during this time because of the bus boycotts. And eventually it gained more and more attention. Now, does anybody know why state bus systems weren't the same? Right, it's because state buses crossed state lines. So they were not held to the same segregation rules as city buses were. And this caused a lot of outrage just because a lot of people didn't think that, states should be held to a national standard. States should be able to decide what they want to do for themselves. So, 1957, who knows what happened in Little Rock, Arkansas? Anyone? Yeah, so basically, it was the first integration of a school of black blacks and whites. There was approximately 9 students who were being integrated into a high school, and this was supposed to be more of a trial. Like, this was supposed to be the beginning stages of desegregation, but this unfortunately led to the school closing 9 years later in 1968. Because of the desegregation attempt, it created a lot of problems in Little Rock, and eventually people were so outraged by it that the school just shut down. So, when people think of civil rights, they think of 2 people, Martin Luther King Jr., and who was a pastor, and then the other person they think of is James Watson. So James Watson, can anybody tell me a little bit about him? No? Well, so James Watson, he was a preacher himself. He was a religious man, and he was also a missionary. And during his time as a missionary, he went to India, where he witnessed nonviolent protesting efforts by Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi is a man from South Africa who protested his own government there, and in a nonviolent way. And so James Watson saw these attempts at nonviolent protesting, like marches, speeches, sit-ins, things like that, and brought them back over to the U.S. to help make that a part of the nonviolent civil rights era movement. Because ultimately there were 2 parts to the civil rights movement. There was a violent side and a nonviolent side. And so this was a way to promote a nonviolent protesting movement, basically. So speaking of nonviolent protesting, can anybody tell me who the Freedom Riders were? Yeah, so the Freedom Riders were a group of individuals, a mix of black people and white people, who would ride around the country in a bus, in a desegregated bus as kind of a symbol of representation, to spread knowledge about the civil rights movement. And they also went around and helped black people get registered to vote, which was really awesome. And so one thing that unfortunately happened is when they would go travel to smaller southern towns, it became a violent situation. Even though the Freedom Riders themselves were a nonviolent group, they would get pulled off of the bus, or they would, get targeted by people who were not fans of their message. So it unfortunately became violent in places where people were upset by the message that they were spreading. I heard a question about the Freedom Riders being the same as the Black Panther movement, and it's not. It's actually very different, but we'll get into that later. So as time went on, the northern United States became more aware of civil rights, the civil rights movement, and began to support it, whereas the southern states began to feel more and more opposed to the idea of the civil rights movement. Now, and if you guys go back into your textbooks, you can find the 5 kind of like starting things that helped the civil rights movement kind of gain momentum. Does anybody know what the first one is? No? Well, so it's black representation. And does anybody know why that was important or where that started? Well, so it was important just because, in southern states, what tended to be the case was African Americans being spread apart. so they didn't have opportunities to band together and have strength in numbers. But as black urbanization became a thing and more people started living in cities, like in northern states, there was more black urbanization, so they actually had the opportunity to have strength in numbers and organize and form a community themselves. So that factor in and of itself created a lot of momentum for the civil rights era, is the fact that they were all able to gather into one area, into one city, and start to make changes. Does anybody know the second one? It's actually churches. So, yes, churches are obviously a place for people to go and practice their religions, but it's also a place where political ideologies were spread. Um, so the leaders of the civil rights movement, most of them were actually preachers. They were actually religious leaders in churches who were kind of at the forefront spreading these political ideologies and these gospels. And it's actually really interesting because churches, these black churches, were places where black communities were able to share information and spread knowledge throughout different communities. So it really became kind of the hub of information for the civil rights movement. And then the third one is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court made segregation illegal in 1958, and segregation was very big and popular in the country in many states, and so when they made it illegal, it stirred the pot. It made a lot of people angry. And, you know, we all know the Constitution, right? It's been around since slavery time. And, you know, change didn't really start to happen until the Supreme Court looked at the Constitution and realized that change needed to happen. And then, so the fourth influential factor was actually television, TV. People were actually able to see representation for these marginalized groups, and they were able to basically get a better understanding of what these people were going through. So oftentimes there was a lack of awareness about the issues that the black community was facing, and so through TV, white people in the North were actually able to gain a better understanding of what their experiences were, and they were able to support them because of their education through TV. And also during that time, there was the African independence movement, where basically that ideology was that if you were a leader in your country in Africa, that you should be able to vote in the United States. But that didn't end up really being successful, unfortunately. And so later, in 1962, 1963, more than 1963 actually, President Kennedy introduced the Civil Rights Bill. And this was a bill that eventually, a year later in 1964, would get passed. But at the time, do we know who the bill was proposed to? Yeah, that's right, in Congress. It was proposed to Congress. And actually, the Southern congressmen were the biggest lobbyists against this bill. And they felt very strongly that the government should not be telling individual states, what to do or how they should behave or treat their citizens. So Southern congressmen were actually lobbying extremely hard against that bill.